Um, I believe this question can be broken down into four parts. Those parts are who or what is BDS? What are BDS's goals? The question of a popular front versus a united front of the working class. And finally, the question of the Israeli proletariat in general, especially in the context of the broader Middle East. So let's take them one at a time, if you don't mind. What is BDS? The BDS is a committee and organization in Ramallah in the West Bank, whose nominal governing body is something called the Palestinian BDS National Committee, which consists of a couple of dozen various organizations, Palestinian organizations, one of which is the National Committee, is the Council of National and Islamic Forces in Palestine. And one of the components of that council is Hamas. So Hamas is indirectly or directly, I guess, part of the governing structure of BDS. And I think, therefore, it's worthwhile exploring for a moment what Hamas stands for. As we know, Hamas is a fiercely right-wing and anti-Semitic organization, whose charter, adopted it, I think, in 1988 and never rescinded, quotes the al-Bukhari hadith, famous hadith, the effect that calling on Muslims to kill the Jews when the day of judgment arrives. The Hamas charter cites the protocols of the Elders of Zion as one of its sources. It refers to Jewish immigration to Palestine as a Tartar invasion. It says that the Jews, with their money, took control to the world media, news agencies, press, publishing houses, etc., stirred revolutions in various parts of the world, including the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we hear about. With their money, they were able to control imperialistic countries and instigate them to colonize many countries in order to exploit their resources and spread corruption. This is well known, and Eddie Ford in Weekly Worker 1374 wrote that revolutionaries should point out that Hamas is an Islamist organization that has a thoroughly reactionary agenda, both within Palestine and the wider region. And the victims of this agenda would be women, gays, Democrats, atheists, trade unionists, socialists, communists, religious minorities, etc. Ford also wrote that Hamas does nothing to divide the Israeli population along class lines, but quite the opposite, helps to consolidate that population behind the Zionist state and its own ruling class. Ford went on to say that if the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain, which had cited Hamas as a revolutionary organization, Comrade Ford said that if the SWP does not think this is anti-Semitism, they have a big problem. But the question is, what does BDS think? I mean, BDS is going out of its way to condemn anti-Semitism, laudably so, but at the same time has on its governing board a fiercely anti-Semitic organization. And I might also point out that when economic protests erupted in the Gaza Strip, led by a group calling itself the We Want to Live movement, the protests were against unemployment, poverty, and corruption. In February 2019, Hamas security forces crushed the demonstrations rapidly. So the question is that Hamas is not only a right-wing anti-Semitic organization, but an organization dedicated to the repression of the Palestinian labor movement. So the question is BDS includes this this organization in its governing structure. The Weekly Worker condemns the SWP for not acknowledging the problematic nature of Hamas, but yet the Weekly Worker, in supporting BDS, essentially does the same thing by failing to mention this problem. So not only does the SWP have a big problem, but the Weekly Worker, the CPGB, does as well. So next question is, what are BDS's goals? And in his writings, Mike Macnair chose to zero in on the boycott plank alone while ignoring all the parts. In his article, No Change of Line, I'm sorry, in WW 1379, Mike defended boycotts against Israel, but drew no distinction between consumer boycotts and labor boycotts. When BDS talks about boycotts, they seem to be talking about consumer boycotts rather than labor boycotts, although it isn't always entirely clear. But Marxists, while not necessarily opposing either of those things, still see them very differently. A consumer boycott is a boycott by consumers, obviously. And consumers belong to all classes. And a labor boycott, a strike or a secondary action or hot cargoing weapons destined for Israel, of course, are a very different thing. They are an expression of the working class movement. And therefore, the Marxist attitude towards working class boycotts, hot cargoing, et cetera, is very different. The second letter in BDS stands for divestment. And those rest on appeals to the international bourgeoisie to withdraw investment from Israel and therefore to disemploy Israeli workers. And the third letter in BDS stands for sanctions. And those are appeals to foreign governments, foreign bourgeois governments, I need hardly add, including Western imperialists and the Gulf states, to impose an economic blockade on Israel. Much, not unlike the economic blockade the U.S. has imposed on Iran, Syria, Cuba, and literally dozens of other nations. BDS also opposes what it calls the normalization of relations between Israeli Jews and Arabs and Palestinians. For example, it calls for a boycott of all Israeli cultural activity unless, quote, the Israeli party in the project recognizes the comprehensive Palestinian rights under international law, and the product or event is one of, quote, co-resistance rather than coexistence. I'm just quoting from the BDS website, by the way. BDS goes on to say, the website goes on to say that quote, any engagement with Israelis, individuals or institutions, that is in the original quote, that is not within the resistance framework outlined above serves to underline the normality of Israeli occupation, colonialism, and apartheid in the lives of the people in the Arab world. It is therefore imperative that people in the Arab world shun all relations with Israelis unless based on co-resistance. Therefore, BDS has called on foreign labor unions to sever links with Histadrut, the Israeli labor union, and for individual Palestinians to withdraw from Histadrut. And it has denounced the West East Divan Orchestra that was founded by Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said on the grounds that it's based on coexistence, not co-resistance. And BDS supporters have gone so far as to interrupt performances by Israeli music groups by engaging in group heckling. The incident I'm thinking of occurred in 2010 when hecklers interrupted a performance by the Jerusalem Quartet in London that was being broadcast by BBC Radio. So I would argue that just as appealing to the international bourgeoisie or to bourgeois governments to disinvest in Israel or to impose a bourgeois economic blockade, I would argue that these methods are completely at variance with socialism in that they are class collaborationist. They do not rely on working class solidarity, and in fact, they are violative of working class solidarity. If all relations with Israelis are forbidden unless the Israelis have pre-committed to a policy of co-resistance, that means, therefore, that any normal relations between Israelis and Palestinians is impossible, number one. And number two, it means that any attempt to persuade Israelis as to the wrongness of Zionism and the true nature of the Palestinian plight, that effort is cut short as well, because there's no basis for persuasion, argument, personal interactions, etc., unless the Israeli in question has already arrived at an anti-Zionist position. And this is also completely counter to socialist methodology. So the question is, therefore, if socialists, if Marxists reject the question of a popular front of subordinating working class forces to bourgeois political forces, then how can they possibly support doing the same thing, defend doing the same thing with regard to the thoroughly bourgeois forces that are behind BDS? And let me just for 1 second, diverge to the question of not only the question of the cultural boycott, but of an academic boycott. I mean, I really actually have no idea how this actually works. I mean, are Israeli scholars to be barred from international conferences? Is their work to be barred from international academic journals? What happens when Israeli scholars make a discovery or breakthrough? Are those to be ignored? And what about Israeli Arab academics? Do the same rules apply to them, or do different rules apply to them? And if it's the latter, how is that not discriminatory? The reason that Hamas is part of the BDS governing structure is that BDS sees itself as an outgrowth, a reflection, an expression of Palestinian civil society. But Palestinian civil society reflects all of Palestinian society, bourgeois as well as working class, and therefore it's inevitable that it would include a major political party like Hamas. But this is not the way that socialists approach civil society. I mean, socialists believe in splitting the bourgeoisie and splitting the working class from the bourgeoisie, and in polarizing politics, so that the labor is counterposed to capitalism. So when WW repeatedly denounces popular frontism, I'm not really quite sure how it defends the same kind of popular frontism in Palestine, and how it doesn't recognize that the working class should have its own policy vis-a-vis the West-East Divan Orchestra, the Jerusalem Quartet, et cetera, rather than relying on bourgeois forces in Ramallah to dictate policy toward them. And finally, the fourth question is the question of the Israeli proletariat in the broader Middle East. Attitudes towards Israeli workers, as evinced so far in WW, seem to be all over the map. I mean, we have Moshe Machover assuring us that BDS's impact on Israeli workers will be almost negligible, quote unquote, and therefore the BDS is a purely symbolic campaign, one whose goal is to, quote, win a moral battle in progressive public opinion, unquote. We have Tony Greenstein saying just about the exact opposite when he argues that the Israeli working class is no ally of socialists, and that socialists therefore should be unconcerned if BDS causes real tangible harm to Israeli workers. And then we have Jack Conrad. When a few weeks ago, when I asked him if he would support during one of these Sunday sessions, when I asked him if he would support an economic strike by Israeli workers, he answered in the affirmative, thankfully. But from his attitude, maybe I'm reading too much into this, he seemed to think the question was secondary or peripheral. But I would submit the Israeli working class is not peripheral at all. Rather, I would say it's a central part of a highly diverse Middle East proletariat that includes Palestinian workers in the occupied territories and in Israel proper, South Asian workers in the Gulf state, workers in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Egypt who've had a long history of labor militancy, impoverished workers in Yemen, et cetera, and that the Israeli proletariat is itself diverse in that it includes not just Jews, but Arabs, Russians, Thai and Filipino guest workers, et cetera. Any socialist movement in the Middle East must not penalize Israeli workers per se, but to the contrary, should welcome Israeli Palestinian workers as comrades in a common struggle against wage cuts, unemployment, imperialist aggression, and so on. And the same goes for cultural national concerns. Jews are now a minority in both Greater Israel, i.e. the territory from the river to the sea, and in the larger Middle East. Their fears, concerns, and legitimate cultural and national aspirations deserve to be recognized, just as no more and no less than those of other minorities throughout the region, such as Alawites, Shiites, Yazidis, Assyrian Christians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Minority rights are trampled throughout the Middle East, and therefore minority rights for all minorities must be a primary concern of all socialists. Tony Greenstein recently wrote that regarding Histadrut, the Israeli Trade Union Federation, that Histadrut was never a trade union, but rather is a great colonizing agency which, for its first 38 years, refused admission to Arab workers, and after that kept them in a separate Arab section headed by a Jew. This is not true. The infant Palestine Communist Party enjoyed considerable success in organizing Jewish and Arab railroad workers who were part of the union that was part of the Histadrut Federation in the early 1920s. The PCP, to be sure, left Histadrut in 1925. But what's absolutely crucial is the PCP did not go voluntarily. Rather, they were expelled by nationalists who were all too aware of the damage they could do to Zionism if allowed to remain inside. So the PCP perspective was one of remaining inside Histadrut, not boycotting it as Tony calls for. And this was the perspective of Trotskyists, by the way, throughout this period. In 1949, for example, a German-Israeli Trotskyist named Gabriel Baer, B-A-E-R, wrote in the journal Fourth International, "The first and foremost task of the Middle Eastern working class today is the demand for the legalization of trade unions and labor organizations. The main aim for which Trotskyist groups in the Middle East must strive is the unification of labor across the imperialist boundaries. Our old slogan, a Congress of Trade Unions all over the Middle East, is not only still valid, but has acquired additional importance in the new situation." And I might add that that Baer was writing in May 1949 after the war between Israel and the Arabs. So that war did not make the question of international proletarian solidarity less pressing, it made it more pressing. And there's been a great deal of talk about how the Israeli working class, presumably only the Jewish portion of that working class, and that's not really quite clear, has somehow removed itself from the international proletariat by virtue of its subordination to its own bourgeoisie and the Zionist project of settler colonialism, and et cetera. And I think that to this American socialist, what's strange about this is the AFL-CIO, the main labor confederation in the US, is really very little different. I mean, the AFL-CIO is so thoroughly integrated into the US war machine that it's been dubbed the AFL-CIA. There's a rich history of racism in US labor.
That's your 4 minutes warning.
Yes, thank you, thank you. Eugene V. Debs called on rail unions to admit Black workers, for example, but was voted down. But nonetheless, he still led the 1894 Pullman Porter rail strike, one of the most tumultuous strikes in US history. The color bar was widespread throughout American labor until communists went on the offensive against it, starting in the late teens and early 1920s. This drive occurred roughly around the same time the PCP was trying to organize against the color bar inside Histadrut. And I might add the CPUSA drive was highly successful. And indeed, so successful, but that by the early 1930s, The Communist Party in the American South was known as, excuse the expression, the nigger party. And to this day, Blacks are more likely to belong to US labor unions than the population is as a whole. But still, a color bar still exists in certain elite craft unions. But our socialist policy is not of boycotting the AFL-CIO as a consequence, but of trying to work within it in order to counter racism from within the labor movement. And I might quote Lenin in Left-Wing Communism: if you want to help the masses and win the sympathy and support of the masses, you should not fear difficulties or pinprick chicanery, et cetera, from so-called leaders, but must absolutely work wherever the masses are to be found. And to me, that includes Histadrut. Or to quote Mike Macnair in his recent article, No Change of Line, our interest in the working class movement is not in the idea of a perfect, purified workers' movement, but of the actual warts and all movement, which very imperfectly points to the possibility of a cooperative future. Just a final point, just to take one issue with Mike and one thing he said about my arguments. He said for the US and in today's circumstances, also for the UK, to pursue a purity politics argument for rejecting outright support for the BDS campaign is unavoidably in practice to solidarize with the witch hunters who deploy closely related arguments. So therefore, I assume from that statement that Mike is saying that criticizing BDS amounts to support for the Labor Party leaders who are trying to drive anti-Zionists out of the party. But I'm left puzzled by this argument because I don't see how it is any different from arguments that Trotsky was effectively solidarizing with the Third Reich in the 1930s in, quote, pursuing a purity politics argument vis-a-vis the Stalinist regime in Moscow. So just to sum up, I think it's crucially important to criticize BDS, which I see as a classic Popular Front enterprise that has brought the working class into collaboration with some very nasty political forces that nonetheless have a certain following in Palestinian civil society, and that we can't be afraid to criticize BDS, even though it may sound similar to certain criticisms and emanating out of bourgeois circles. These things are inevitable, and that it is wrong to try to shut down criticism of BDS on this basis. So I know that the CPGB is deeply committed to BDS as part of its work against the Keir Starmer regime. But I think that it has worked itself into a very bad anti-labor Popular Front policy. Over to you, Stan.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. That's the argument against. And now Mike Macnair, half an hour on.
I'm going to talk, I think, slightly about different territory, but we'll see how far that we intersect. I start with defeatism and the point that in wars, we take the view that, quote, the main enemy is at home, or taking it not Lenin, but August Bebel, not one penny, not one man for this regime. It is not governed by the merits of the other side. It holds equally true if the enemy is the Kaiser, or for Germans, if the enemy is the Tsar, or if the enemy is the horrors of the British Empire. Parvus, one of the fairly famous contributor to the idea of permanent revolution, in August 1914 became an advocate of German defensism. He became an advocate of German defensism in the name of, in the first place, of solidarity with Turkish self-determination, the right of the Turks to self-determination under a regime where they were currently had their tax offices and judiciary and so on and so forth controlled by the British and French creditor committee. And then the second article he wrote on the topic is about the self-determination of the Ukraine as a reason for justifying support for the German state. In 1917, this is going in a slightly different direction. Karl Kautsky moved from his initial position of saying that the workers' movement should support only defensive war aims, should make its support for the German regime conditional on purely defensive war aims and general pacifistic objection, to writing about the national question and in particular about self-determination of Belgium and Serbia. That is to say that Kautsky in spring-summer 1917 ceased to be a defeatist in relation to Germany, whenever was a defeatist in relation to Germany, but moved from the pacifistic position into an Entente victory to the Entente position. And that victory to the Entente position led Kautsky in October 1917 to denounce the November 1917, to denounce the October Revolution as a coup. Behind this argument for defensism consists the proposition that we're in the business of the overthrow of this constitutional order. We're in the business of the overthrow of this constitutional order in the same way as the English oppositionists who in 1639 collaborated with and supported Scott's invasion of Northern England, military invasion of Northern England, in order to force Charles I to call Parliament. And like those who in 1688 asked for a full-dress Dutch invasion, invited the Dutch to invade England, was a full-dress military invasion. Unlike the American revolutionaries who after 1776 allied with the old enemy, France. We're in the business of the overthrow of the Constitution because the overthrow of the constitutional order sets free the elements of the new society with which the old collapsing society itself is pregnant, marks on the Civil War in France. While conversely, this isn't in Marx, but there's plenty of bloody evidence of it, the preservation of the old constitutional order, the state intervenes to reverse social developments and artificially preserve the old social order. Geoffrey Parker's work on 17th to 18th century France is extremely clear on this. On a larger scale, we can see it in China in the early modern period and in Japan under the Tokugawa regime. So we are in the business of the overthrow of the state in order to set free the state order, in order to set free the elements of the new society. That has the consequence that when our state is involved in war, our primary responsibility is not to give advice of one sort and another to our comrades in the targeted regime, but our primary responsibility is to carry on a defeatist agitation. The point is not victory to the other side. It's not that we are for the victory of Hamas. It's not that, on the contrary, we are all Hamas. We denounce this line of the Socialist Workers' Party that we are all Hamas. It's not we are for the victory of the Kaiser in 1914. It's not as Lenin put it, it's not to blow up bridges and in other ways assist the state in repressing the workers' movement. It's to recognize that the war has become central to politics and to conduct an anti-war agitation which stretches as widely as possible and as far as possible reaches even into the armed forces. What we're concerned with, therefore, is an agitation. It's in this context that actually it's misleading to say there is a difference between workers' action in the form of labor boycott and consumer boycott activity and similar points, because what we're concerned with is not strike action. We're not proposing a syndicalist version of blowing up bridges and other ways assisting the state to repress the revolutionaries. We're proposing to get the widest possible understanding in the society as a whole of of opposition to the war. In this context, symbolic campaigning is as important. Symbolic initiatives are as important as direct action initiatives. The boycott campaign in this sense is a campaign of symbolic initiatives. And if we consider going back to the 1860s, the campaign of workers' solidarity with the Union side in the Civil War, certainly a campaign of solidarity in this case with a bourgeois side of the Civil War, was merely a campaign of counter meetings. That is to say that the cotton manufacturers tried to get up large public meetings in order to urge the government to use the British Navy to break the Union's blockade of the Confederacy. And the workers' movement got up counter meetings. It was merely organizing larger counter meetings. What came out of these counter meetings was the initiative for the formation, this movement of solidarity with the North, was the overthrow of an older leadership of the workers' movement. The labor press at the start of the war was actually largely pro-Confederate, and the overthrow of this older leadership created the opportunity and the opening which gave rise to the formation of the First International. So why do I say that this is about a war? I say this is about a war. I've said this in the article which I wrote in response to Comrade Lazare the other week. This is about a war for two reasons. It's about a war for the Americans, because the Israeli state is no more autonomous from the US state than the East India Company was from the British state. Obviously, that was not true originally, but post-1961, post the turn of the Kennedy administration to what became described as the settled policy of the United States that Israel should have a qualitative military edge over its neighbors. The operations, the military operations of the Israeli state are operations which the US state can turn off at will. It isn't necessarily the case that it starts them any more than that the British state started and chose to take the military operations of the East India Company. Nonetheless, the United States can turn these off at its will, and it does turn them off at its will when it suits its diplomatic agenda. So as far as the United States is concerned, this is a colonial war carried on by an agency of the United States, which is the Israeli state. It's the profound illusion of many liberal and quite a good many labor movement opponents of United States support for Israel, that this reflects Israeli interests and the Israeli lobby, the success of Israeli lobbying in the United States. On the contrary, it reflects simply the interest of the United States in holding veto power over the state polities in the Middle East, to preclude the possibility of alliances which could affect the US's geopolitical power by allowing other people access to, given that the form of the US military operations depends on the use of petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel. It's not that the US needs the petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel of the Middle East. It's that the US insists that it should be able to turn off the supply of petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel to France, Germany, China, which are the countries which are hypothetical, potential rivals to the United States. And that until the early 2000s, that policy was a matter of the United States. Britain and France, and indeed Germany, were allowed a substantial degree of political autonomy in their dealings with the Arab countries. Britain and France in particular were allowed that degree of autonomy because of the historical colonial relationships between Britain and France and the several post-colonial Arab countries, and also actually Britain and Saudi Arabia, which had never been formally colonized, but had been, the Saudi royal family was a creature of, was sponsored by the British state in the interwar period. 2003, the war, the run-up to the war in 2003, the actual anti-war movement in 2003, the failure of France and Germany to support the war in 2003, the invasion of Iraq, led the United States to determine that the autonomy of the European countries in dealings with the Arab countries, and therefore their right to do, as they had done from time to time, explicitly denounce Israeli military action, that should go. And the means of overcoming the autonomy of the European countries in their relationships with the Arab countries was the creation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, quote, definition of anti-Semitism, and the campaigns which were got up initially in Germany around this question, and carried after Jeremy Corbyn unexpectedly won the leadership of the Labour Party into Britain. The consequence of that is that Britain becomes a party to the United States' war operations through its client regime in Israel. And we are now in a situation where, rather than we are half on the sidelines because the British state keeps its maneuvers between, as it did, in fact, between 1967 and 2003, maneuvers diplomatically between support for the Israeli state and endorsement of Arab states' demands in relation to the Palestinians. That ceased to be the case, but in place of it, it becomes the case that truth is the first casualty of war. The form in which truth is the first casualty of war takes in this context is two central forms in relation to this stuff, one of which is in relation to is what's called whataboutery. That is to say that Israel is by no means unique. It's true Israel is by no means unique, but Israel is as being a tyrannical regime. Israel is unique Israel was unique. I got one thing wrong in my article. Israel was unique until Indonesia annexed East Timor, which was the first open and express violation of the Nuremberg principles. And I say of the Nuremberg principles, I should say, because somebody wrote in the letters column condemnation of what I argued in relation to Crimea. Now, Crimea is a violation of the Nuremberg principles and UN Charter, but that's simply because that's a purely juridical point. And in essence, actually, the United States in 2003 committed a repudiatory breach of the Nuremberg principles and UN Charter by waging aggressive war against Iraq, so that we should regard this as being, it's a juridical point which is out of date. Israel is unique because it's, as Comrade Macnair has argued, it's a live settler colonial regime, which is actually still taking land, continues to take land for the benefit of settlers coming from elsewhere. Israel is unique, secondly, because of this point that this Israel is the immediate client of the United States in the way in which no other colonial regime is the immediate client of the semi-colonial regime, settler regime, whatever, is the immediate client of the United States in the sense of being given, quote, a qualitative military edge over its neighbors. Australia, for example, doesn't have a qualitative military edge over India or China. It has a US nuclear umbrella over it, and so on and so forth. The single exception, as I said in the article, is South Korea, in relation to which the view of the United States continues to be that there is a war on the Korean Peninsula and that the North Korean regime is an illegitimate rebel regime which needs to be overthrown. And for that reason, the United States continues to arm the South Korean regime for war purposes. Okay, so Israel is, whataboutery is misconceived. The argument for whataboutery is misconceived and false. It is misconceived and false because of the character of the relationship between the United States and the Israeli regime. And since the United States' turn in the wake of Iraq to recover control over more, to reverse, to prevent any repetition of what happened around Iraq by using the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that also affects Britain as well. I'm not quite sure how far it affects France, but in the same way. It is now a war of our state, which our state has chosen to make itself a party to, and in which the question of defeatism is engaged. The second side of this is the second argument, which is the argument for solidarity with the Israeli working class, which Comrade Lazare has made more explicit in his letter to the latest Weekly Worker and in his speech at the present time. Solidarity, I should say, particularly with the Israeli Jewish working class, because of the concern about legitimate national and cultural aspirations. Now, there are two fundamental mistakes involved in this argument. We start from the point of view, suppose that we were Palestinian socialist organization, or indeed a socialist organization in Egypt or Syria or any, God help, in any of these other countries, God help us, the situation that you'd be in, then the strategic orientation of trying to make a class unity across the borders and separate the Israeli Jewish workers from the Israeli Jewish bosses would be a plausible and in some respects desirable option. But to suppose that this is the only strategic option is misconceived, because it presupposes that it is impossible either the United States will be overthrown, that the world hegemony of the United States will be overthrown, or that the United States will shift its military technology, that there will be a sufficient shift in the military technology that the aspiration of the United States to keep a stranglehold on the Middle Eastern oil taps will go away. And then in either of those cases, the foundation of the imperialist support for the United States will go away. Reducing the imperialist support for the United States is actually more likely to produce separation, a degree of separation of the Israeli Jewish working class from the Israeli Jewish boss class, as we can see, in fact, with the real decline of loyalism in the 6 counties in Ulster, that the very partial withdrawal of British state support for loyalism caused crisis and difficulty in loyalism as a political trend, and so on and so forth. So that's one issue. The second issue is the conception of the nature of class movements, of which underlying it, the conception of the nature of the working class. Why should we suppose that the Israeli working class is, as Comrade Lazare writes in his latest letter, the centrality in the larger Middle East of an Israeli Arab-Palestinian proletariat composed not just of Arabs and Jews, but of Russians, Thai and Filipino guest workers, and so on? Why is that central? Why is that a country of 5 million, which you're talking about 5 million to exercise control over roughly 200 million Arab-speaking population of the Middle East? Why is that minority central? The supposition is that that minority is central because it's a minority which is employed in industry, and the underlying assumption, just as the assumption makes a radical separation between labor boycotts and consumer boycotts, and says labor boycotts are a working class tactic and consumer boycotts are not a working class tactic, that assumption is actually syndicalist. The underlying assumption is that the working class can take power because it is in industry, that the working class can take power because it's in work, and the unemployed workers and those who are otherwise dependent on the social wage and so on and so forth cease to be part of the strategic orientation of the working class. This is okay. This is coming from the history of American Trotskyism. It's in the fundamental conceptions of James P. Cannon. Going along with that, also Cannon's theses on the American Revolution, there's a messianic role attributed to the American working class. That role is attributed to the American working class because of the centrality of industry in the United States, of the industrial preponderance of industry in the United States, and it's conceived. It was a delusion. Comrade Lazare is entirely correct to say that the Communist Party of the USA built mass movements against the color bar and in favor of black organization. The Socialist Workers' Party of the United States and its descendants among the Spartakists and so on had delusion that because they had led some strike actions and because Cannon came from the nativist wing of the Communist Party of the USA in the 1920s, they had the delusion that this little organization of a couple of thousand had overtaken the CPUSA in 1946, and that they were the natural leaders of the world revolution. And this delusion has affected all the tendencies which grew out of that political tendency. So there's a false conception in relation to mobilizing the Israeli working class being central to the Middle Eastern working class. There's a false conception in relation to the idea of the overthrow of Zionism inevitably taking the form of class differentiation between the Israeli Jewish working class and the Israeli Jewish bosses. I flagged just one thing. There is it's not a typo. It's a bad piece of bad writing on my part, though there may have been editing. I wrote reject outright support for BDS, and that's ambiguous. What I meant by reject outright is reject altogether support for BDS. Reject outright support for BDS could mean we have to give outright support to BDS. We have to follow them down the line because they're the representatives of the oppressed. I don't agree with that. But on the other hand, to argue for no support to BDS on the grounds that it's a pop front and so on, actually, this is not me artificially saying this is using the arguments of the witch hunters. This is actually unavoidably, this is using the arguments of the witch hunters in the immediate context. That's it.